Hi everyone, I'm Jim Tolles. As many of you know, I'm a spiritual teacher. I blog regularly at spiritualawakeningprocess.com. And of course, I give these free talks every 2 weeks. Today's topic is feeling alone and disconnected after awakening. And I think it's going to be an interesting conversation to get into. For those of you who have already signed on, if somebody could just leave a quick note in the chat pod to let me know that you can hear me, that would be fantastic. And we will probably spend a few minutes just kind of all settling in, making space for people to log on. Before I launch into today's thoughts, as many of you also know, I usually free flow for about the first 20, 30, 35 minutes, and then I will get into this questions that people may have regarding loneliness that I might not have answered. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, and I apologize if I get anybody's names wrong, but thanks, Srila. You're all welcome to spell out phonetically how I should say your name too, if you'd like. 2 weeks from now, I'll be back at the 6 p.m. Pacific time talk, and that will be about family stuff, because I don't think I've spent enough time talking about family, since that's primarily where most of us grow up. That's where most of our beliefs are being embedded into us. In that talk, I'm going to delineate between some things that I call blocks. A friend of mine recently kind of mentioned something she learned from a therapist about the fog of family, the fog being fear, obligation, and guilt. And I think that's a great segue into talking about blocks, because those blocks don't even allow you to deal with the issues. So you see what I'm doing with this metaphor there. So hopefully, if that time works for you, you can join me for that talk. And as I said, it's 2 weeks from today at 6 p.m. Pacific time. Of course, I'll announce it on the blog, spiritualawakeningprocess.com. And I also have a newsletter. So if you're not signed up to the newsletter, that's free. And it's also on the blog on the left-hand side, or if you click the little menu icon, that should get you over to it if you're on a iPad or a mobile phone or some other magical device that they've created that uses that design function. It used to be so simple to give on-screen instructions when we all had the same device. It was all just like the same, computer, and you had the huge hard drive tower over here. And now everybody's on a different device, so it's like, what are you looking at? What version are you on? So hopefully you can find that if you want to sign up to the newsletter. And the newsletter has different things each week, whether it's announcing new talks, the newsletter kind of main theme of the month talk, or not talk, but just as the topic I go into in more depth. So like the last one was talking more about core issues and getting to the core of things. And then some other blogs that I think are important that I want to share around. So like next week, the topic of that newsletter is underappreciated blogs. So I'm going back into some of my blog posts that I wrote, and some of which, I really like, but they just don't get seen. And that's just the nature of the internet. It has so much stuff on it. A lot of good things get buried. So I'm trying to find some of those things that get buried. As I go, you're welcome to ask questions and post comments in the chat pod. You have to be logged into YouTube to be able to do so. But I usually get to those questions later, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. So if I don't answer it immediately, I'll look at it later. And of course, I answer intuitively. So sometimes I feel intuitively guided to share something, sometimes not. That's part of learning to be authentic with our voices, as we speak when something important arises inside us, and we stay in a space of silence when there isn't anything arising. That can be a very different thing for a lot of people, where a lot of people are used to just speaking, or always having somebody, respond verbally to anything they say. So being with silence is its own practice, and the more you can be with silence with yourself, the more you can be with silence with others, the more you find your own answers. So the topic of speaking your truth is probably best left for another talk. Today's topic, feeling alone and disconnected after awakening. The loneliness issue is such a powerful one. It drives a lot of people to the spiritual path because they're seeking some sort of connection. And we have to pause and ask, what does that mean? You see, a lot of times we just assume that whatever feeling or thought arises in us, that it's correct. That if we feel lonely, then we feel lonely. We don't even necessarily understand what that means in our bodies. And we accept that that's correct and that we should act upon it. But loneliness is just a label for physical sensations of some kind. So the first step to really looking at this experience, before even getting to the topic of this, what it means to be alone and feeling disconnected after awakening, is to just look at loneliness regardless of awakening and say, what is this? What is this feeling? What is it like in your body? Clearly it has a lot of power over people. As I said, it will launch people into the spiritual path, and it causes people to do a lot of different other behaviors to avoid the feeling, to get rid of it. As any of my longtime listeners and students know, you can't get rid of things. We're learning to embrace all of these things. So the first step to embracing an issue like loneliness is to be curious. Say, if I give this much power to something, what is it? What is it? Is it a clenching in your stomach? Is it a tightening in your chest? Is it some sort of funny feeling you can't describe happening in your head? When we bring attention to these body aspects, it really illuminates a whole other world that's going on inside that we're taking for granted. There are three main aspects to loneliness that I also want you to think about. There's the actuality of being alone. Right now, sitting here in my apartment, I am alone. That's my actuality. That's the physical reality I am in. I think separate from that is the idea of being alone, because sometimes you can have this idea that I'm all alone, but you could be standing in a crowd. You could be at a yoga class, and yet this idea might surface. Right? On some level, there's a belief that whatever connection that you think you should have isn't there. And then there's the feeling. And as I often say, and I said in my last session, feelings trump ideas every time for a human being. That's why a lot of people don't understand how elections work, right? The elections are driven by human feelings. It's not by ideas or which candidate has the best idea. It'd be nice if that was the case, but feelings drive people. And so that's what ends up happening in politics and marketing, and any form of persuasion ends up becoming about how do we manipulate this person's feelings. Whether somebody realizes that overtly or not is something else. But that's what's going on. So on a macro level, learning to understand your own feelings is deeply empowering, because it means other people can't manipulate you on that level. I'm not even sure I have words to describe the feeling of loneliness. It's not the biggest issue for me. I've found a lot of refuge in time, in solitude, and things like that. So for me, this is probably the reason why I haven't talked about it too much on my blog. It's just not been like one of the dominant ones sitting in my wheelhouse of work. So that's part of the reason I haven't gotten into it. And I don't know that it's a sensation that comes too often for me. But that's irrelevant, because the tools that I'm talking about can be used for any different thing. And the tool really is you stop and you start to sit and say, okay, I'm feeling this sense of loneliness, or maybe we're calling it disconnection. I mean, are the two even the same? Maybe they are, maybe they aren't. Breathe into it and see what's actually happening. Now, obviously, the idea of being alone and the feeling of being alone like to mutually reinforce themselves. I really emphasize this important peeling away of ideas and beliefs from our feelings, to just be able to look more at a feeling for what it is and to see it rather than to just inherently believe it. A lot of times we come up with a belief and then we create the feeling. Sometimes the feeling comes first and then we put the belief on top. So breathing and relaxing is one of the ways we start to neutralize that really nasty negative feedback loop that goes on and goes round and round and round. It's like, I'm alone. So you're telling your body you should feel these lonely sensations. And so your body creates those. And then You go back to your mind, and your mind is like, no, I feel even more alone. And so then the body says, well, I guess this person wants to feel more lonely. So here comes more of those sensations and biochemicals and all the things that go together into creating this sense of loneliness. And see, if we don't do this, what we start to do is we start to blame the external world. And as any of you know that have done a lot of inner work, we can't do that because the external world is going to keep doing all sorts of different things. That doesn't mean it has to impact our feeling states. Certainly we're interconnected and there's some levels of feelings that we're going to experience from the world around us. That's fine, but a lot of it really is our own unconscious choice. And I'm really driving this point these days around these unconscious associations that go on so quickly inside you that they've already decided what you're going to feel based on a situation. You didn't even think about it. You just walked into a situation and then you said, oh, I feel bad. And some people confuse this as being an energetic sensitivity too. Sometimes that's in there, like things aren't necessarily clear cut. We're human beings. We got to get used to the messiness. But a lot of these associations go so quickly inside that you're not even thinking. So some people have very clear minds after an awakening, for instance, but it doesn't mean they're free of belief. In fact, somebody could have a very uncultivated mind, and maybe that's why the mind quiets quicker for them than somebody else. And they need to start thinking more actively, start to understand where are these sensations coming from? What are the choices I am making about this current situation that are dictating how I currently feel? So this is a very, very important level of self-inquiry. If we don't do this level of self-inquiry, we're still at the whim of these unconscious beliefs that are creating this feeling experience inside us. And this applies to all feelings, so not just loneliness. So I really want to set this table on a bigger level to understand before we dive into that loneliness part itself. As I said, we've got three things going on. We have the feeling of loneliness, the idea of being alone, and then we have the actuality. And sometimes you will notice that your actuality is that you are alone, but you don't feel lonely. So what's going on? If the two were innately related, innately connected, you could not be physically by yourself without having that feeling. So clearly a choice actually has to be made to create that feeling state. And conversely, like I was mentioning earlier, you could be in a crowd and you could feel alone. But your actuality, your physical reality is that you are not. You're surrounded by people. So what has to happen then? Well, the ego doesn't like these little illuminations of its lies, and so oftentimes we start to create reasons. Well, I'm in this crowd of people, but I don't know anyone. So therefore, I feel disconnected and I feel lonely. Ta-da, I did it. I proved my own point. You know, it's one of those self-fulfilling prophecies. This doesn't get us anything. It just makes us more miserable. So instead of trying to justify, right, that's that part of saying around, we just inherently believe our feelings and our thoughts as correct. So instead of believing them as correct, we say, okay, there's a disconnect here. What is this loneliness feeling? I'm in a crowd full of people. I'm not alone. And conversely, you may also want to investigate when you feel connected. What is that like? What are the sensations that are coming up then? What are you calling connection? It's just so important to bring illumination to these sensations that are getting these labels, to understand what's happening. And then you come back to your breathing and you're present to them. You don't try and get rid of them. You breathe and relax into them. As I say, endlessly, come back to your breathing. Be present to what is here now. This is your current experience. The longer you can sit with it, the more you can discover about it. The more you become aware of the ideas and the beliefs that are going on in the background, the more you can investigate those. if we don't do this, as I said, we just end up blaming other people. Well, this person isn't being this way. Because you can have somebody in a marriage feel like they're alone in the marriage. And so you're like, well, now you're obviously seeking something from somebody else. And so people come with this long list of what's wrong with their partner, or what's wrong with their kids, or what's wrong with their parents. That doesn't mean people don't have issues. This is just about illuminating these deeper choices inside of us that are saying, I want to feel a certain way or have a certain experience, and I don't like the one I'm having right now. Right, once again, this extends beyond the topic of loneliness. As I also repeatedly mention, the human experience embraces all kinds of experience. We can't narrow our choices to just one or two. If we do that, we inherently are creating a whole load of separation that's going to cause so much suffering, because these one or two experiences that we do like are going to be dwarfed by the infinite number of other experiences that we don't like, or we don't really want, or we're neutral towards. So you see, this ego preferencing is a huge issue. Learning to be at peace and open to all experiences just becomes the only rational thing we can do. But that's not what we do. As I said, we start to blame all the different people. We blame friends. If somebody starts to evolve in the spiritual path, then they start to blame their friends for not being spiritual enough, because they can't talk to them or understand the different spiritual things they're talking about. Or we blame society. And society at large has a lot of issues. The way we create and perpetuate certain forms of separation. But we can't let that be our focus. Because as I said, life is going to continue to do a lot of different things. Some of you are going to have very difficult lives. Some of you already do. And learning to be at peace with life as it is and to be at peace with yourself is critical. Other people have more comfortable lives, and yet in comfort, so many people are uncomfortable. The ego self just doesn't seem to be happy in just about any situation it gets put in. It can only be like momentarily content. The upshot of all of this is to appreciate loneliness as another experience that arises. Now, getting into the context of a spiritual awakening in particular, spiritual awakening, so many things arise and pass so quickly. A lot of it really is a loss of ego, right? That's something I talk about quite a bit. And when that sense of separation between life and you goes away, there can be a lot of euphoric feelings, and those can get labeled as connection. So some people go through a bliss state, some people go more towards the state of peace. Since peace to me seems more closely related to a body's natural state of relaxation, that tends to be what I focus on more. Bliss to me seems to be a little bit more agitated. But saying that I focus more on that peace side and how we start to relax more deeply in our bodies and our hearts and our minds is not a negation of everything else. It's an understanding that that's a fairly stable human experience. The truest stillness within us, the presence, embraces all experiences, however. And that's really what we're focusing on. We're focusing on how do we train our human self to be like the divine self, the divine presence, the divine oneness that embraces everything as it is. And in that embrace, when our attention in awakening is kind of turned towards that sense of being, suddenly a lot of the disconnection and the loneliness and lots of other fears and issues just drop away. And it starts to show us how illusionary they are. But illusionary doesn't mean they don't have real physiological impacts and that there aren't strange things that go on inside of our bodies. The body's got all sorts of interesting sensory data that it's tossing our way. But the juxtaposition, because most who have an awakening aren't prepared for it, is striking. So it's very natural for the part of us, if we had a very blissful experience, an enjoyable one on some level, to be like, I want to get that back. So here's the space where suddenly we're very connected, or rather we're realizing the connection that's already there. But we associate that connection that's already there with a feeling state. So we have to kind of divorce this idea that connection is a feeling state we have to achieve rather than a state of isness, a state of being, which has no particular feeling in and of itself. And that can be kind of hard for our ego minds to wrap themselves around because we grow up in this very sensory world. We're given lots of external input from society that we want to have good sensations as well as how we feel physically in our bodies. So the concept that a passing experience that we later identify as a blissful experience after an awakening is difficult at first to understand, and it leads to people a lot of craving to try and get that sort of connection back. And the tendency after that, of course, is that any experience doesn't last, and we tend to return to our old ego state, which is very separate in how it thinks, how we think about ourselves and who we think we are, and all those types of things. So we go back into, let's say, the prison cell. So if awakening is like it busts us out, it helps us to realize there isn't even a prison cell. That doesn't even exist. Then we last there for a few minutes, a few hours, a few days. Some people can get into months or years. But at some point, people come back. They come back to the prison cell. Say, well, that party's over for whatever reason. We get scared about something. We start to have upset feelings again. We get trapped into something, called into something. And then we go back into this confined way of thinking and understanding ourselves and being and interacting again. We cut ourselves off from reality. And then we feel alone again. And all that stuff happens very unconsciously. So we don't even realize usually, even after awakening, we're not realizing yet all the choices we just made. So some of aloneness is ego constriction. So on top of all the other feelings that go on inside of us, some of it's just the way we constrict ourselves. We say, I can't be this, I can't be this, I can't be this, I can't be this. All the different rules. And after awakening, what happens for usually a brief amount of time is we let go of those rules. So the work becomes learning to let go of rules intentionally. Say, okay, I just found this self-worth issue. Self-worth issue is a rule that says I should feel bad about myself. That's all it really says. It gets layered with lots of reasons because that's what our egos do. We try to justify why I should feel bad because we don't understand the feeling. Sometimes there's an initial experience connected to it. Sometimes that's just built up over seeing how our parents don't like themselves or our families or friends or society. So that gets mirrored back in so many different ways to not like yourself as you are, rather than to be at peace with yourself as you are. That's where the work comes in. To get rid of these ego levels of disconnection. But at no time are we trying to get rid of it. So this is the interesting little distinction that people really need to grasp, that the more we look at something, the more the thing kind of tends to dissolve. But it's through that looking through an embrace that it goes, not through trying to get rid of it. Getting rid of things is a false notion as well, and it actually kind of creates more separation. To me, it's like having a wounded left hand and a right hand punching it. Right? It's like, I don't like this wound. Right? What do we do to let a wounded hand heal? Nothing. We give it space, it heals. Right? But we acknowledge that it's there, so we're not trying to do things, whether we're not hurting it more. We realize what the wound is. We may figure out what we did to initially wound it, and then we cannot do that again. And the same goes with a lot of different ego beliefs and different tensions we hold within, different old unprocessed pains that we're holding inside. That's a big reason why people disconnect and they start to numb. It's because all this old unconscious pain that they didn't know what to do with when it came, trauma particularly being very bad, we intentionally disconnect in those situations. We say, no, I can't handle these experiences, these feelings, and we find ways to suppress it and to numb and to distract. So there's a lot of society and a lot of beliefs that intentionally are there to cut ourselves off from parts of ourselves. That is what they're there to do. And I think that's a really helpful thing to understand, that a lot of society is intentionally disconnecting things. It's like all the fences we put up, right? Those are intentional boundaries to keep things out and to keep other things in. And boundaries aren't necessarily inherently bad or anything like that. But it's just understanding the functions of belief, the functions of the different things we set up inside of our minds. So there's a lot of layers here to loneliness, from just things that the body does to ideas that we create in our heads that tell our body to make ourselves feel lonely, to these ideas that become kind of unconscious beliefs that sink down inside us and start to maintain levels of disconnection with ourselves. The more disconnected, more pain somebody has, the more they want to disconnect, the more disconnected they are, that feels terrible. And so that can make somebody even feel like they want to go home. This is a common phrase in certain spiritual circles. And it's a sense that the spirit world is better than the human world. But it neglects to look at the state of the human body and the beliefs and the things that are going on inside. It's usually the person's thinking that something's wrong here, it can't be fixed, I got to get away from it. So it's a flight mechanism. Anybody who's ever kind of had that and worked for a long time with me ends up not having it. Because when they've done their inner work, they start to realize, wow, this body is wonderful and beautiful, and I like being here. There's definitely, the way the ego looks for commonality too. So ego uses commonality as a way to say, I can feel connected or I can open up. In the instance of a spiritual awakening specifically, or just anybody on the spiritual path, you tend to look for people like yourself. That's what the ego does. That's commonality. It says, oh, this person had an experience like me, I can open up. Or they can understand what I'm talking about. And if we don't feel like we can find that, then we say, hey, I can't open up, so I'm going to stay. I still feel alone. One of the beautiful things about true connection is it has nothing to do with commonality. And this can be a revelation in and of itself for people, that you can connect deeply to somebody else, that you have vastly different ideas about life, that you can't talk about certain things. And I'm not talking physically or anything like that. I just mean at the pure energy presence level. There are amazing connections that you have access to when you let go of the ideas about what it should look like, or when it's safe to be connected. So that's an aspect of the ego: safety, safety, safety. It's the safety first sort of a thing, but not in a good way. So that's another reason people feel alone, is they're looking for commonality, especially with a spiritual awakening. That's a very rare thing. Most of what people are calling awakenings are spiritual openings that kind of inspire people to start doing spiritual work and to investigate, rather than a spiritual awakening that's being driven from within, where it doesn't matter what you do, it just keeps arising. And I make that distinction because how you help those two different types of people is very different. But either way, you can get people that are like, oh, I have to have this type of a person in my life, otherwise I feel alone, or I have to have this type of a community. And that belief cuts you off. That's just what it does. I mean, certainly it's nice to find people that have similar experiences to share on that level, but it can't be the reason for connection, or it can't become something that becomes a striving. Otherwise, you're just constantly going to feel alone. And certainly the more open and aware you become, the fewer people are going to be able to relate on that level. So sometimes with spiritual awakening, basically you just get to swim out in the ocean of oneness. And you just don't expect other people to be out there swimming. That's not what they're doing. That's not good or bad. It's just understanding levels of interest in the spirituality, levels of interest in truth. So those are some initial thoughts about this topic of loneliness. The topic of, these ego beliefs that we create about ourselves, about what life should be and what we should want from life. And as I said, always go back to the feeling. Go back to the sensation. We label a lot of different things as fear, loneliness, anger, right? These are conceptualizations of body feelings. So go to the body feeling first. Don't inherently believe that this is the correct interpretation. We made a lot of these interpretations when we were very young. We're like 0 to 7 years, which is something I'm also emphasizing a lot more, that in those early years, we start to set up a whole lot of beliefs, a whole lot of ideas about what we're feeling and how to label it and how to act from those labels. Spiritual awakening, as it's grinding away the ego, you're going to get down into some of these deeper things. So anytime something like craving comes up, it's like, what is that? What does it feel like in your body? Is there pressure in your chest? Is there some sort of tensing or tightness? What's fear like? Does it feel hot or does it feel cold? Like, these sort of sensory words can help you really get involved and start to make different choices in the body. And the breathing and relaxing that I'm always talking about is so central to it, because that's you talking directly to your body in your body's language. Now, to be sure, a lot of disconnection is also feeling the disconnection of humanity to itself right now. That as you open up, you just become more aware of things. So along with dealing with your own ego disconnections and things like that that you have to process, you become more aware of how disconnected people are from each other and from themselves. But the more at peace you are with yourself, the more it just becomes like looking at a cloudy sky. It's like, yes, I know there are clouds in the sky. It's not a clear blue sky today. There's nothing wrong with that. So I think that's really important thing to understand around this level of sensitivity we also step into, that if you're feeling disconnected sometimes, it's just you being sensitive to the situation. No different than if you're feeling heat. Well, you're just being sensitive to the sunlight. It's producing heat today. It has nothing to do with like the heat in your own body. Right, so there's a certain level of being able to distinguish, and that develops over time. The more you know yourself, the more you have a sense of what your energetic space is like and when you're experiencing other stuff that's going on. And as I said, as you let go of issues inside yourself, then you're not triggered by it. But a lot of what happens is people open up after awakening. They sense the disconnection of everybody else. They don't fully understand their own disconnection, but they feel it. So they start blaming everybody else. And this can lead to the crusader type. The crusader type has like an awakening, or more often than not, it's just an opening, where they realize some level of truth and like, I have to tell everybody about this. I have to get everybody like this, right? What's the ego doing? It's trying to make people get put into that commonality space, right? That they'll be like them. That means that they'll be safe. Because that's a lot of what the ego does. So these are some initial thoughts. I apologize for the lawnmower thing that's going on outside the window. I hope you can still hear me. If you have any questions, feel free to write them in the chat pod, and please keep most of the questions and comments directed at me. It's a small space, so crosstalk between each other can bury some people's comments. So there's a comment from Carlippo. So basically it's my mind making up any feelings of existential loneliness then, and the key is to just breathe through it and realize my connection to everything. Really enough, I never feel lonely in nature. Is it because there's no need for ego stuff there? Well, I think that's what the exploration is for you, Carlippo, to really start to look into what are the feelings happening and what are they like. Because I know what you're talking about. If like I'm in my apartment or if I'm in nature, how I feel is really different. So it definitely kind of has that quality of feeling cut off in an apartment, but what is that? So I just encourage you to explore it, to see what's happening in your body. Human beings, we respond to a lot of different information that goes on around us. And so think of any space you're in as kind of a form of information. And that information is being interpreted by your body, by your emotions, by all these thoughts. And it's just happening so fast that the emotion comes and we don't know where it really came from. We just assume, well, I feel this here. I'm very concerned about the existential word because that just screams the mind. The mind's creating reasons for something. And the ego mind does this a lot, Carlippo, because it's trying to help. It's saying, okay, here's this feeling. I don't like this feeling. What's causing it? How do I get rid of it? How do I fix it? And that's as deep as it goes. It doesn't say, oh, is this feeling correct? What is this feeling exactly? What am I actually responding to bring this up? So when we start to say that, there's some sort of bigger spiritual crisis or anything we start to really place out there, it's time to sit and be with ourselves to really see what's going on. And as many of you know, the longer you sit and breathe and focus on this present moment, a lot of sensations and feelings come and go, and things tend to even out. Thanks for the question and comments. What else is on people's minds? And while I'm pausing, I just want to say a big thank you to all my donors. You're the reason I get to do this work. If anybody would like to help support my work, you're welcome to donate. Down in the little info box below is a link to the donate section of my blog, and any amount is appreciated. You're welcome, Carlipo. This is from resident 9011. I crave being alone, but my conscience will not allow me to set boundaries for people who hurt me, and I want to heal their emotions for them, and so I'm rejected by them. How do I feel okay walking away? Well, firstly, we're only responsible for our own space. We're only responsible for our own emotions. So in much the way that I'm talking about learning to explore our emotions and find out what is that? What is sadness, for example? It's like, we use this word, sometimes there's crying, sometimes not, but what is that? What does that mean in the body? What does that mean in physical, concrete terms that you can express to yourself? So that's our journey, and so that's also the truth for other people, that you can't heal their emotions. Their emotions are a bunch of unconscious choices, and none of us know half the unconscious choices that are going on in somebody else that tell them to feel a certain way about themselves, about somebody else, about a situation. It's a recipe for disaster to try and anticipate all those different things. And since most people aren't in what I call a near and present danger situation, there's no real need to do anything. So a near and present danger situation is they're going to self-harm themselves, they're going to harm somebody else. That type of a situation. Then we're mindful of it, that, okay, this is a time where maybe I'm going to try and manipulate emotions. I don't like using that word, but, it's somebody's about to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge or something like that. Then we're like, oh, you're a great guy, come on back, we'll hang out. And, we start to try and build them up. So that's manipulating emotions, is what I'm talking about, because there's a bigger issue at hand, which is the loss of life or some sort of serious physical harm. Setting boundaries is just really important in general as far as finding space to do inner work. That it's a sticky topic, because on the one hand we can get caught up in the I don't want to be hurt thing, and the I don't want to be hurt thing is your own unconscious responses, because so long as someone's not physically doing something to you, your emotions are your choices. That's just such an important point to understand. Our emotions are choices, for the most part. There's stuck emotions, there's strange things that the body does, like when you wake up angry or something. It's like you're not choosing that. But most of our emotions really are choices, so understanding that is really key. And the more you understand that, the more you realize other people can't emotionally hurt you. So that's another point to appreciate. And the more you can be in that strength inside yourself, then you can set appropriate boundaries, because now it's not about self-protection. It's about, I need some time for myself, rather than I need to get away from you because you're going to hurt me. You see, those are two very different things. Now, clearly, if somebody just wants to be emotionally abusive all the time, my next question is, why are they even in your life? And we create a lot of beliefs that have to be investigated. And I think that's really where I would point you, resident 9011. You need to start to really investigate a lot of your beliefs about who you are, how life should go, what emotions you're having, why you're having them. Those are all choices, because in looking at these beliefs, you can let them go, and you can start to really be more empowered in yourself. If we don't do this work, the external world's always changing, which means we're going to be constantly responding to different things going on around us. And that will feel like we're being torn in 50 million different pieces, and that nothing is ever going our way, or that when it is, it's like holding a bunch of marbles, stacking a bunch of marbles, or herding cats. So I definitely encourage you to find time to be alone, because that's definitely a space to do this work. Take a vacation, go camping. But being around people will also be an opportunity for inner work to investigate the different choices, different feelings that are coming up, and then breathe and relax. Because if we want to have any level of clarity with these different situations, we need to be at a certain level of relaxation. The more scared we are, the less consciously we think, the more our brains just go into that fight or flight mode and really don't serve us well. So I hope those are some useful thoughts. What other questions do people have? I mean, for some people, solitude is its own practice, because I haven't talked about this while people are thinking and writing any questions they have. Fear of being alone is a big deal. You're welcome. Right? The fear of being alone really drives a lot of things. And this to me is kind of a multi-generational and social wound, because if we think about it, being alone in the 15th century, right, there's no social safety networks there. If it's just us, we have to do everything for ourselves. We have to sew and cook and hunt and farm and build houses, and I mean, so many different things. So it's a huge burden to be alone in that situation. And that's how I think a lot of societies, really form together out of mutual protection. So there's a very deep cultural belief that says being in a community is protection. If you're not in a community, you can be hurt. You're in a much weaker position to take care of yourself. You're in a weaker position to raise a family. So let's not miss some of these different social beliefs that are deeply ingrained into our psyche. So it's a question from Jake. He says, I've heard you say in a post that the solitary path may be suitable for some. I am at the point where I am just enjoying the silence alone time. Yeah, for a lot of people, solitude isn't a threat. So, I mean, this kind of is an interesting topic in and of itself, that being alone for some is viewed as a threat, and for others it's viewed as safety. So this is that fight or flight mechanism that goes on inside us, and this often depends on our childhoods, how we experienced being around other people. So if being on your own felt really supportive and good to you, then the loneliness thing isn't a big issue. And if you feel called towards silence and alone time, that's fantastic. And Jake follows up, so I've always enjoyed being alone. Does this need more investigation, do you think? It feels the intuition that I prefer to be alone. Just don't want to run away from issues. Well, I would encourage you to spend some time with people from time to time and see how you feel and see what comes up, and then go from there. So we don't need to turn something that isn't an issue into one, right? So if you enjoy being alone, that's okay. But you can, if you want to journal about it, I think this is my last thought before answering some other questions, but if you want to journal about it, say, what were my initial experiences of being on my own growing up, that'll probably help you to understand how you orient towards it. As I said, those early years, 0 to 7 years old, really set up a lot of foundation inside around our emotions and how we instinctively react to situations and different people. Thanks for the questions and comments, Jake. Hi, Lisette. How do you know you've cleared an issue in solitude when you're not triggered by others for an issue? Well, you don't need others to trigger issues inside you. But certainly when you come back out of solitude and you're interacting and a similar situation sets up and you're not triggered, then you know it's not there. So, I mean, it's just something that you will learn, I suppose, as you continue to practice and you take time to be by yourself, and that'll work on some issues, and other issues come up in different ways. I hope that's helpful. From Carlipo, I liked your remark about looking for similarities and being in a perceived weaker position, being alone. Well, I'm glad you liked it. it's the way that I try to fold in certain human realities. Like we don't get away from a lot of generational issues, right? Generational issues are powerful. Society formed in certain ways to self-protect. And at the core of the ego really is about self-protection. There are three fundamentals, as you've heard me talk about before, at least three fundamentals that I've identified. If you identify more, let me know. But, the fundamental of surviving, which is about fear of death and fear of pain, because if we're in pain, we may be nearing death. But obviously they're not the same. Some people, the pain is so bad of living that they'd rather die and they commit suicide, which is a very sad thing. And then, of course, the drive to procreate. And to some degree, and I'm still kind of sussing this out in my head, to some degree, that drive to procreate is also kind of connected to protection of children, right? That's very instinctual for a lot of people. Maybe that's just a projection of oneself, and their own need to survive onto the child. I don't know how people talk about that, but it's another powerful one. So those kind of three main areas. We don't like death, we don't want to be in pain, and we're trying to keep the species going, that drive to procreate. And so the two big ones around safety are the drive to avoid pain and death. And so that's what a lot of ego does, and since that's what the ego does, that's what society does. Society is a mirror of the ego. If we don't like society, then that's just a mirror of what's going on inside most of us. And so, interesting, if we really think about it, like, I may be in an apartment by myself, but I'm not really alone, because look at all the stuff around me that I can't make. I can't make that door back there. I probably could figure that one out. That's not too complicated. This computer in front of me, forget it. Right? So this is society actually being all around us, even when we're physically on our own. So when we talk about being alone, in that looking backwards into history, think about like not being able to have any of this stuff, that you're just living in a log cabin and it's what you can make. That's a very difficult life. And if you get sick, you better hope your body can handle it. So I think there's some very, very powerful long-term generational social memories that are stuck inside a lot of people that say, like, if you're on your own, you're in a very difficult situation. Then, of course, if somebody's had a situation that happened that was traumatizing, growing up, where they were by themselves and they were lost in the woods or something like that, where they needed help but they couldn't get it, they weren't around people, that will obviously create an impression, and that can be a key experience that underpins that fear of being alone. Thanks for everyone's questions and comments so far. Feel free to keep asking. If you haven't asked, please do so. We don't have that much time left. And as I said before, thanks to all my donors. You're the ones who make these free talks available. And if you'd like to support me, there's a link down below in the info section to how to donate. And I blog regularly at spiritualawakeningprocess.com. If you're brand new and you just stumbled across this live feed, feel free to join me over there. I've got like more than 700 blog posts, so you'll have plenty to read. And of course, Jim Tolles is my channel name here on YouTube, with hours and hours of me chattering along. From Lizette, she says, for example, in nature, all my problems go away, but when I'm around certain people, they get triggered again. Yeah, well, then when you're around people, that's an opportunity to breathe, relax, and see what you're getting upset about. Clearly, you want something, and you're not getting it. Or you don't want something, and you're getting that. So if somebody is talking about politics and you don't want that, then you're getting triggered because you don't want that conversation. There's a lot of different things like that, Lisette, so pay attention. Usually we don't really have to try that hard to find issues. And if you're spending a lot of time in nature and you're feeling very peaceful, then there's a lot to be learned there. There's a lot to be learned in peace and silence and relaxation. The more you drop into peace and silence and relaxation, the more your heart opens, your mind opens, your ability to perceive gets sharper and clearer. And at times, being alone is important, especially after an awakening when you have a lot of sensory stuff going through you. Once again, this is why I'm very particular about how I use this term, because the way I describe awakening, things are moving on their own. So they are bringing things up. In a true awakening like that, you can be getting triggered all the time without external stimuli. And that was always helpful for me, actually, because I was having these fears and these triggers come up when there's nothing wrong going around me, nothing to say this triggered me. That really helped me to hone in and say, this is something that's trying to be processed, rather than, blaming something else. And it was kind of an interesting experience because that went on for years, 6, 7, 8 years. And when, that all settled down and actually got triggered externally by a serious event in my life, it was like, oh, that's what that's like. It's like I kind of forgot what that was even like because so much of it was happening on its own. So alone time can be really, really critical to really get a sense of yourself and to understand the work and to learn how to allow it, to understand the issues that are coming up, to investigate them. Sometimes I describe this as like doing open heart surgery, and we don't just let anybody wander through the surgery room when we're doing this kind of deep work. So if somebody has a core issue around the fear of being alone, that'll be one of the first issues that they have to deal with in solitude. Of course, working through any core issue means returning a whole lot of energy, a whole lot of your own power back to you, because core issues take up so much power and they create so many behaviors and thought patterns and other things that require a lot of energy to maintain. And so, for instance, if we don't like being alone, we can be constantly having to do stuff and to be around people to make ourselves feel better so that we don't have to deal with this feeling. People get into marriages precisely because they're scared of being alone. And so all on top of society telling them that they're supposed to do that. Another thought from Carlipo. I spent a lot of years traveling alone, but never felt lonely in other societies. But here in the West, I'm struggling with this disconnected feeling as people seem so wrapped up in their lives. Well, as I said earlier, it's time to investigate what sort of response do you want. Maybe the people were naturally giving you responses that you did like when you were in other societies. As I said, there's a lot of unconscious beliefs and associations that build up early on in terms of how we view what's going on around us. And it usually is working in that very simple, basic binary, the 0-1 of safe, not safe. I mean, you're not going to get an argument from me, Carlipo, about how messed up a lot of things are in the West. When I go out and I do things and I'm interacting in society, I definitely look for groups of people that are more focused on community and interaction, not just going to a bar and drinking. That to me is useless. It's not interesting. And to me, drinking is a way that people numb a lot of these feelings and sensations we're talking about today. So I don't have any argument about that, but I just know what a trap it is if we start to say, well, it's the external world, because if we say it's the West, I mean, that's a huge term for Western culture. All that's not going to change overnight. And of course, generalizations get us in trouble too, right? Because there are pockets of communities that are working to create connections in a more human way that we're talking about. But we have to let all that go. We have to let it all go and go inside, because the more at peace we are with ourselves, the more at peace with everything, including feelings of being alone and whatnot. And that's just the central aspect of the spiritual path, to be open and at peace with everything. And that's a powerful, powerful statement, I know. Because life can throw a lot of very painful and difficult things our way, and the body itself can draw up a lot of painful and difficult things inside. But this will empower you in ways that you can't possibly imagine. It is such a powerful place to own your space that when an aloneness feeling comes up, you don't respond. You don't waste energy trying to get away from it, trying to call somebody, trying to do something. You stay in the present moment. And so you stay in that present moment and you stay in a flow. A lot of these reactions are medications. We're trying to self-medicate away something we don't like. And that draws us away from how we naturally grow, naturally flow, and naturally evolve. So then a loneliness feeling comes up. You breathe into it. You feel terrible for 10 minutes. It's done. And you continue on with whatever was going on. If we resist it, what tends to happen is that feeling stays. And then we're caught up constantly trying to find new things to repress it. So something that would have been done in 10 minutes is now still going on 10 years, 20 years, 30, 40 years later. I'm sure it goes into repression or goes into regression from time to time where it disappears. You don't really feel that lonely right now. And then it comes right back. And it can be this short. I know some of my students listening today know this, that whenever we've gone into an issue, it's 5 or 10 minutes. It doesn't feel like 5 or 10 minutes at the time. It feels eternal, and the ego says this will never end and I can't handle it. And this is what the ego always says. And then 5, 10 minutes later, it's gone. And I'm not saying the whole issue, but I'm just talking about the feeling. Sometimes, though, like the core issue or some part of the issue comes up and breaks out, and then you're done with that. And that is just so empowering because now you are not being controlled by these feelings, by these old associations. And this kind of leads into a whole other discussion about what it even means to make conscious choices. Because if we don't deal with these beliefs, these associations, and these feelings, we aren't making decisions. We're being told how we feel and what we should do. Another comment from Carlipo. Haha, true, yes. Okay, another reason to dive within myself. Thanks, really helps. I'm glad you're receptive to it. So maybe time for 1 or 2 more questions. If you haven't asked one, now's a great time. And as I said at the beginning of the talk, I do these talks every 2 weeks. They alternate between this 10:30 a.m. Pacific time, so my friends in Europe can join, and then they go up to the 6 p.m. Pacific time. So all the people in America who work can join, as well as my friends in Australia and New Zealand over on the Pacific Rim have a time that they can join. I'll be talking about family blocks, as I said. You know, those issues that block us from even looking at family issues. Hi, Laura. I've had a hard time communicating with others in a deep way sometimes, and that can make me feel isolated. Right, so inherent in that is there's a desire for a feeling, and there's a desire to be recognized in a certain way. Right, so those tend to be reflections of self-worth issues, that on some level you're not trusting yourself, you don't believe in what you're saying, and you need somebody to validate it, say that, oh, that's right. And that can be useful from time to time, but the deeper we go, Laura, the more we have to just simply trust this inner awareness. And inner work gives us that ability to really trust it. That when you know how your ego works, when you know your core beliefs and your issues and how they sound to you and when they come up, you know when that's what's trying to respond versus when it's something that's truthful to you. Initially, everything's so intermixed and intertwined, we don't tend to have that perspective. And so we can feel that uncertainty. We can't let ourselves be unknown to us. And it's ironic to say it like this because we've been living with ourselves our whole lives, right? How can we not be unknown? But we really are. I mean, even if you just want to think physiologically, how much does any of you know about how your lungs work? I really don't. Like, I know air goes in and they go out, and there's alveoli in there, and there's a, trachea, and there's 2 parts of it. Right? We don't actually know that much just about our physical body, much less the whole emotional body and the ego beliefs and all those different things that are going on inside. So knowing yourself, firstly, that's going to make that easier to communicate because you know what you're saying and you trust what you're saying as you work through like self-worth issues. And if other people understand it or not, that's fine. Like, lots of people don't understand what I say, but the more relaxed you are on yourself, that's okay. You're just sharing a perspective. Thanks for the comment, Laura. And thanks to everyone's comments. So I hope everyone can join, if it works for your schedule, the next talk. You're always welcome to shoot me an email if there's a topic that you would like. I'm happy to respond to those. And as I said, if you ever feel like supporting me, donations are appreciated. Sharing this video, which we'll record and post in about an hour to my channel, that's appreciated. Sharing links to blog posts, that's all really appreciated to help spread the message, to help people feel empowered, to learn how to do their inner work, and to be at peace with themselves. So thanks, everybody. Have a beautiful rest of your afternoon, morning, evening, wherever you may be. Lots of love to you. Take care.